We have to know where we come from if we're going to have a clear idea of where we're going. If we have illusions and false ideas about who and what we are and how we got here, then that illusory state is just going to continue into the future. We need to understand the forces that were involved in shaping the modern world.
Ancient Sumeria. According to mainstream scholars, this is the birthplace of civilization as we know it, the birthplace of religion, the first science, the first war, and the first written word. Now all that is left is a message buried beneath the sand.
It's one of Iraq's most famous archaeological sites, rising from the desert near Nasiriyah in the southeast, the Ziggurat of Ur, a massive 4,000-year-old temple pyramid, and the surrounding ruins of an ancient Sumerian city.
Archaeologists and scholars have been piecing evidence together for centuries in this area of the world, hoping to prove the biblical stories of the Garden of Eden.
Most people think, well, we're interested in the Middle East because of the oil. And there's a lot of truth to that. But at the same time, you're going to find people who are very interested in these different esoteric philosophies, like the Freemasons in government, the Christians in government. All of these people have long had a strong interest and also believe that there may be some kind of power or some sort of connection there, that if you make it, it empowers you in some way.
What kind of power could these groups have if they could prove how humanity started? The search for something more powerful than our own current reality isn't a modern concept, but rather an ongoing search for the location of the Garden of Eden, the proverbial beginning.
There's been a fixation amongst biblical scholars, early archaeologists, that everything in the Middle East began on the Euphrates and the Tigris, down in what is today Lower Iraq. And that this is where the Garden of Eden was. This was where everything emerged, good and bad, in the sort of Genesis tradition.
In 1922, English archaeologist C. Leonard Woolley went to southern Iraq to hopefully find the Garden of Eden, based on early discoveries of Sumerian cuneiforms. However, what he actually uncovered instead was the exact location of the ancient Sumerian city of Ur. Was he getting close?
The early archaeologists were trying to prove the Bible, and they were funded by biblical societies. And that's, in other words, they had to come up with the proof, and it ignored a lot of legends and traditions which suggested that these cities were elsewhere.
Could Woolley have ignored some important information that was revealed several years before? In 1849, almost 75 years earlier, thousands of Sumerian cuneiforms were found northwest of Ur, at the ancient cities of Sippar and Nippur.
In 1849, Henry Layard performed many excavations on the Sippar site and discovered about 20,000 tablets, Sumerian and Akkadian. And amongst all the tablets discovered, about a dozen of them are about the Garden of Eden.
Could this be the location of the Garden of Eden? Or was this just another clue leading researchers to another location?
Subsequent cultures, whether the Assyrians, whether the Babylonians, who rose to prominence in that area, who were not Sumerians, nevertheless venerated and highly valued everything that the Sumerians did. And that's why we can read the Sumerian language, because those later cultures made a project of taking Sumerian texts and translating them into their language. And those are languages that the scholars could read because they were Semitic languages. They belonged to a language family where the code could be cracked, whereas Sumerian was an isolate. And without those translations done by later cultures who nevertheless had contact with Sumer, we would not be able to read those Sumerian texts at all.
Were these later cultures able to decipher the beginning of humanity? Sumero-Akkadian researcher and author of 8 books regarding Sumerian translation, Anton Parks, believes that for hundreds of years, we have been translating these tablets wrong.
Jerry Zeitlin, qui est scientifique, qui a travaillé pour le projet SETI.
Gary Zeitlin, who is a scientist who worked on the SETI project for many years and collaborated with NASA, he was very interested in the Sumerian translations, and he provided me with these 10 tablets found at Sippar to check symbols one by one. I noticed one translation saying one thing, and the other saying sometimes the complete opposite. The two translations did not comply. I persistently did research on Hebrew, but nothing was coming out of it. And then completely by chance, I came across a Sumero-Akkadian lexicon, and this is when I could finally, slowly start to translate the tablets.
What Anton Parks began to translate was a completely different version of the Garden of Eden than we've heard before. Not only had the words been mistranslated, the actual location had been overlooked.
In biblical text, we constantly read about this idea of heaven or paradise. This comes from the Greek paradisios, and this literally means enclosure for wild animals. Not paradise, a term that was later transcribed as garden during the Hellenistic era. If we go back to the original translation in the Sumerian tablets, it says, "The men who serve the gods work for them in the garden and are treated like animals." It is a very clear and recurrent theme. They are slaves who serve the divine community. In Hebraic texts, we understand that the humans seem happy in this so-called paradise, which is, in fact, more like a concentration camp, according to Sumerian texts. In my translations, we also discovered the word Karsag, which translated to City of the Gods. It's interesting that all the highest points in Turkey are named Karadağ, which strangely resembles Karsag.
Karadağ translates to Black Mountain, and also refers to the highest mountains in Turkey. The only summit with the name Karadağ that is close to the Mesopotamian plain and tributary of the Tigris, and only a few kilometers from the Euphrates, stands 29 kilometers south of the city Sirt and 19 kilometers southwest of the city of Ur. Is this the paradise described in the Sumerian text?
Jerry sent me images of this site from Google Earth. And at the back, on the mountainside, there is a little plain. This is where I think the Garden of Eden of the gods was located based on my translation of the text.
The Garden of Eden was where the 4 rivers emerged from, 2 of which are easily identified as the Euphrates and the Tigris, which do indeed obviously flow through modern Iraq and empty out into the Arabian Sea. But they rise in southeast Turkey, and the other 2 rivers can be identified as rivers that also rise in southeast to eastern Turkey. All of these rivers emerge in the same general part of the world, which we know today as either eastern or southeastern Turkey.
With the decoding of the Sumerian cuneiforms and the location of these 4 rivers, could this be the actual location for the Garden of Eden? The closest paved road to the proposed location is Highway 5651. As easy as it may seem to get to this location to excavate, scholars and archaeologists consider this area highly politically unstable, and it has remained untouched. All we have at the moment is the language to decode from the Sumerian cuneiforms, the cuneiforms that describe a different kind of paradise. These 10 tablets, according to Anton Parks, tell the Sumerian version of how the Garden of Eden was created.
Lorsque les dieux sumériens sont arrivés sur Terre, et se sont établis sur cette montagne.
From my translations, I discovered when the Sumerian gods arrived on Earth,
Pour pouvoir survivre, parce que
they settled on this mountain in order to create a colony and be able to survive.
ils auraient subi des dommages et qu'ils
Apparently, they
auraient,
suffered damage and ended up on this mountain because of a war, and they found shelter.
sont d'accord pour dire
Many
que
experts believe that they came from the Pleiades star cluster.
le système nucléaire, que peut-être la guerre a été
My opinion is that they came from there.
ces parages.
Maybe the war broke out around there,
Je pense que c'est
but I really believe that this is where the Anunnaz were created. During this conflict, on one side you have a matriarchal regime, and on the other side, a patriarchal one, with all these new gods. There are conflicts in space, those new landscapes, like it says on the genealogy of the land tablet. These gods are going to change the way life gets implanted on Earth. The gods are going to create new conditions for life to bloom, for their colony to thrive.
But who are these gods that hope to make Earth their home?
The Epic of Atrahasis and others, they talk about that the earth was actually administered by a conference of gods or a group of gods in an assembly. It wasn't just one god. Yeah, they would have like their equivalent of the prime minister or the CEO who would be in charge of this group. Enlil, Enki, that were the primary members of this Congress there.
Well, Enki and Enlil in the Sumerian system are an interesting pair. Enlil is this rather sort of overarching, domineering, angry, dangerous entity. And he doesn't really care about humanity. Humanity are not very important to him. But then we have Enki, the trickster, and the god of wisdom, actually. And he does care about humanity. And he intervenes on the human level.
They are called gods, but they were humanoid beings of a rather reptilian type. The text of Eden that I translated depict clearly and quite frequently the reptilian features of the gods. I personally estimate that the gods arrived approximately 300,000 years ago. And this derives from the fact that Homo sapiens arrived shortly after. I say this because throughout the text, genetics and the transformation of the human being are recurrent themes. The two particles that compose the word Eden are E, which means home, and Din, or Tin, which is life. But indeed, they are not alone. Humans are already on Earth. Who are these human beings?
If the Sumerian gods realized that they were not alone, what might have been their interaction with these kinds of humans?
What can be noted in the Sumerian tablets, when they clearly speak of creating workers to serve the Anunnaz, the main geneticist is always Enki. He works with the genome that is on the planet to create a new kind of human. He is usually helped by priestesses that we often call the Nintis, who are the priestesses of life. They know how to clone with him. He can change the human genomes according to what Enlil asks of him, which would be left-brained, well-disciplined humans.
When we look at the Sumerian tradition, it is a group of beings rather than one being that creates humankind. So it is not a single creator, but a group of intelligent, technologically advanced beings. And where the Sumerian creation varies from the Christian traditions, for example, and some of the native traditions, is in the Sumerian traditions, humankind began with the sacrifice of the life of an advanced being, of a god from Sumeria, so that that god's DNA, or the blood is what the texts say, could be mixed with the elements of the earth to create the first viable human.
These are the people who have the knowledge to clone. They can clone themselves and then humans. In the text, it says they take the genes from their opponents, who they consider inferior, who they name as Kingu. They use their blood, and they will go on to create the new human who is going to serve them with these genes.
Researchers like Gregg Braden stumbled across some research that has connected the Sumerian translations to an actual genetic change in our chromosomes.
Shedding new light on these creation stories is with the mystery of human chromosome number 2. Human chromosome number 2 is the second largest chromosome in the human body. It forms about 8% of the DNA in every cell. And what makes it such a mystery is that it appears to be the result of an ancient fusion of pre-existing chromosomes from primates that have been fused in a very precise way, and the fusion site has been modified and stabilized so that human chromosome number 2 is optimized for us today. This has happened in a way that cannot be explained by evolution as we know it today. Now, why is this important? Human chromosome number 2 contains the genes that largely set us apart from all other forms of life. The cortex of the human brain that gives us the ability for things like logic, empathy, sympathy, compassion, the ability to consciously trigger conscious states of self-healing within our bodies. These are possible because of what has happened with human chromosome number 2.
Could chromosome number 2 be the work of a master geneticist, otherwise known as Enki from the Sumerian text?
Justement, à tout moment, il peut aussi clandestinement changer le code humain pour...
It is said that Enki secretly modifies the human genes by group or by location and imbues some humans with a knowledge that is different, to the point where the other gods turn against him. His experiment will change the human genes to enlighten mankind. And throughout this cloning process that the Anunnaki and Enlil are overlooking, I think that some humans filter through all of this and start becoming independent.
Anton Parks points out that this is something that the gods did not expect from these new humans that keeps appearing in the ancient texts, and that is the human ability to be more than just slaves. This forms a division of the gods, a division that causes a war that has set the tone for humanity today.
An interesting and very important name in the biblical text and the Sumerian text is the word Adam from the Garden of Eden. Extensive tests have been conducted to see where this word came from, consistently looking for Hebrew roots, but it is a Sumerian word which means animals. Again, we understand that human beings were considered to be animals by the Sumerian gods, and this is where lies the conflict between two gods, Enki and Enlil. Enki wants to treat them like the other gods.
These two Sumerian gods have a conflict over the use of humans, and it is to be the root of the biblical story of the serpent in the garden. As the story unravels, the riddle starts with the origin of the word Satan, or Satan in English.
Satam
in Sumerian means the administrator. For years, everybody has been looking to find where this word came from. Books revolve around this issue. It is a Sumerian term. I don't understand how nobody saw it. It is very clear. We find it in ancient lexicons. Enlil is often referred to as the Great Satam, the Master Administrator. In the Sumerian text, Enlil systematically asked Enki to go negotiate and talk with humans. He is always the one to deal with them. Remember, he is a humanoid with reptilian features. And in Sumerian tablets, he is always, or very often, called the serpent, just like in the Bible. He is the only one that the humans are going to see. And when they see him, they see a serpent-like humanoid. I reckon this is why he is called the serpent in the garden. He is a friend of the humans.
In the biblical text, the serpent tempts Eve with an apple from the forbidden tree of knowledge. Yahweh, or God, from the Bible, forbids the humans in the garden to partake from this tree. According to Parks, the Sumerian version of this story translates Yahweh, or the biblical God, into the great Satam, which according to Sumerian text is Enlil, and the serpent in the garden as Enki, who has become a friend of the humans.
Alors c'est intéressant de se poser la question.
It is interesting to wonder why the serpent in Sumerian text, just like in the Bible, comes to the woman. I think there are two reasons. The first one is that I think the woman was more accessible and available when she was in the garden. Therefore, he was more often around women who were collecting food for the colony. The second reason is that I think women are the future of mankind. They raise their children, they transmit their knowledge to their children. Enki is going to tell the women the secret of tool making. This is expressed as niche in Sumerian, which means tree. This means for the first time mankind could have two sides of the tool. The side is fundamentally good so that they can take care of themselves, and the tool that is fundamentally bad, which they could use to defend themselves. One could wonder why Enki insists on getting this particular secret through to the humans. Well, he has the desire to set them free.
If indeed the knowledge that Enki portrays to the humans is a tool, is this an actual ancient weapon that some believe certain organizations are looking for? Or is this Enki teaching the humans about the infinite abilities they possess through their DNA?
Il apparaît un épisode absolument incroyable.
There's a spectacular scene where humans take up arms and go up the mountain of the gods to revolt, and even maybe try to kill all the gods. What happens is an abomination. They put back on track the few survivors. Indeed, from what we can grasp from his personality, Enki was all about peace and wouldn't use tools in order to kill, as he was perfectly aware of what would happen. So this scene of humans rebelling against the gods is quite special, and it cannot be found anywhere in the Bible. Each time I see the first movie of the Planet of the Apes, it makes me think of this story. Let's put this back into context. Replace the apes with reptilian gods, and you have the exact same story. It is the exact same story. It stayed somewhere in our brain, and this is why we can find similar elements in movies. We can find similarities as well in human behavior.
Could this situation be the biblical fall of man? Some scholars, like Graham Hancock, believe that free will to decide was the real purpose of Enki's intervention.
We are here at this plane, at this level of existence, to learn the lessons of duality, to make choices between good and evil. And it's very clear in the ancient Egyptian system that those choices were important and that they would define us ultimately and set out the route map for our immortal destiny in a way. I would say that in Enki and Enlil we are looking at a dualistic pair. And what's interesting about that dualism is its intense focus on the future of humanity and what happens to us. That matters to Enki. It doesn't matter to Enlil. The Sumerian problem is that we don't know where the Sumerians came from or who they were, their language. I mean, we have endless Sumerian artifacts and endless Sumerian tablets, but their language is actually not related structurally to any other known language family. It's completely isolated and unique.
But could the Sumerian problem have been a way for Yahweh to install his own rules so the humans would not revolt again? Is this why we don't find any of these translations anywhere else, and why we have the establishment and religious beliefs surrounding our existence today?
Finalement, la Genèse, c'est pas si clair que ça qu'elle aurait été rédigée.
The book of Genesis was really written between 200 and 300 BC. It is important to know that the Bible, where we find the most complete book of Genesis, is dated from 400 AC, which brings us to this idea, that when scholars are compiling the book of Genesis, they must have made a choice. A deliberate choice to keep or take out some elements in order to make the Bible as we know it today.
Is it possible that modern-day religion and government structure have been mistranslating our human past to keep us under the control of Enlil or Yahweh? Experts like Billy Carson still believe that the knowledge from these gods were able to further our human imprint on this planet.
When you look into the ancient Sumerian tablets, they talk about these gods that came here to Earth and basically rose them to a high level of civilization and taught them everything that they know. Now, these gods didn't do the labor themselves, but they imparted this wisdom and information onto the humans that actually did the labor.
Could these gods have created us in their likeness? Was the Garden of Eden the beginning for not only the gods' reign on earth, but also humans? And could the constant search for the Garden of Eden be a programmed loop we hope to understand?
The symbolism is very important in our sense of ourselves collectively and personally. There is something lost. We don't know quite what it is, but the story suggests it's the lost connection with the transcendence. And so we wish we could go back, not only to the Garden of Eden, but in other ways, go back to some earlier time. Nothing is more significant in the received wisdom than the story of the Garden of Eden.
Graham Hancock believes that not all is lost when you look to other ancient texts that tell a similar story.
What's dynamite in the Gnostic system is that the Gnostics believe that we have been hoodwinked, that entity that we have been taught to call God and worship is no such thing.
We're here today to announce the first synthetic cell. As soon as we had these two sequences, we thought, if this is supposed to be the smallest genome of a self-replicating species, could there be even a smaller genome? Could we understand the basis of cellular life at the genetic level?
On May 21st, 2010, this historic announcement was made by Craig Venter on the first fully functioning, reproducing cell controlled by synthetic DNA. Every protein of this cell was based on a synthetic code they had developed. As exciting as this was for bringing in a new era of science, the question was posed: then what is life if we can just create it through a code? There are some experts that have suggested that an ancient blueprint was left behind. In 1929, an American archaeologist named Matthew William Sterling began suspecting that artifacts emerging out of Mexico belonged to a time much earlier than the suspected Olmecs. He concluded that these artifacts were actually Mayan. In 1941, Sterling unearthed a large carved stone monument in the Mesoamerican site Izapa of Chiapas, Mexico. He named this Stela 5.
And Stela 5 is a description. It's a sketch of exactly the type of world tree that keeps showing up in different forms all over the world in every indigenous culture you look for. One of the things that's a very common element that we see in the Mayan version are birds that are nesting in a tree. Then there's also the belief that in the upper part of the tree, it sort of represents the tangible manifest world. And then the area of the tree that goes below the surface of the earth represents the underworld. The Mayan tree of life depicts the oneness of humanity, that we all come from the same root and that we've all branched out to become one of many.
The Mayan tree of life may not look like a coded depiction for the human genome. However, researchers started mapping its imagery. They counted 12 human figures, a dozen animals, over 25 botanical or inanimate objects, and 9 stylized deity masks carved into the stone. Given the multiple overlapping scenes, it appears to be a narrative. But what is the narrative? And could Sterling's suggestion that these images belonged to a much older culture be just the beginning of its origin?
Well, let's go back to the Garden of Eden. In the Garden of Eden, there are actually 2 trees of significance. One of them is the tree of knowledge of good and evil, which Adam and Eve eat from, thus entering into a state where they may begin to make responsible choices for which they will have to bear the costs. And the other is the tree of life. When the demiurge drives Adam and Eve out of the Garden of Eden, he states his motive, and the motive is kind of eerie. He says, this has to be done. They have to be driven out of the Garden of Eden. They've eaten of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. The next thing they will do is eat of the tree of life. And then they will become gods like us. That statement is actually in Genesis. What on earth is going on there? What does that mean? Is there some deeply buried secret of transcendence that demiurgic and archonic forces have concealed from us from so long? Is there a tree of life? Is there something beyond what we think of as the span of human life? Some eternity that is offered to us?
One meaning that people give to it is that it was the tree that leads to physical immortality. If you look at the old Mesopotamian writings, one of the big conflicts between humans and the gods was the gods did not want humanity to have immortality. Most people interpret that to be physical immortality, that we live and die too soon, it goes too quickly. And meanwhile, the gods were said to have lived 20,000 years or 50,000 years or longer, so why not humans? And the idea was that humans were perhaps programmed that way to die more quickly, so they couldn't be like the gods. And so the tree of life, by that interpretation, would be that this is the formula, or this is the knowledge for how you attain that much longer time span physically.
One of the greatest mysteries of the Sumerian civilization and the artifacts that have been found from that civilization is the ancient Sumerian kings list. They identified the time of the Great Flood that is almost universal in every indigenous tradition I've ever studied, and the length of time of the rulers from that time until more present times is right on. It is very accurate. And where this gets really interesting, the names of the rulers, the time that they ruled on earth, the lengths of their reigns are all within reason. Prior to that time, we're looking at kings who are said to have ruled for periods of time of thousands and thousands of years. So for example, the very first king listed is said to have ruled for 28,000 years.
Could these Sumerian gods or rulers have been able to live for 28,000 years at some point? Or is this just another meaning for something else carved into the stone?
Another interpretation of the tree of life is that it meant the awareness of spiritual immortality, that humans kind of go through this lifetime, they go through this between lives, and there's a memory loss, and then they get reincarnated, and they've forgotten all the past, and so now they feel like, oh, life is just 70, 80, 90 years, not realizing, no, it's this whole continuum that goes back thousands, hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of years.
Alors, dans les textes sumériens,
In Sumerian Eden texts, just like in the Bible, we find two trees: the tree of life and the tree of good and evil. The tree of life refers to eternal life. As far as the truly inaccessible tree of life is concerned, it relates to ways for people to achieve transcendence. This way, people can truly liberate themselves.
The Mayan Tree of Life stone and the Garden of Eden Tree of Life aren't the only references that represent this same concept. In fact, throughout many cultures, it is found depicted in almost the same way.
The Mayan Tree of Life is a very good example of the concept of the cosmic tree, the tree from which life and creation emerges from. It was seen to exist essentially in the center of the world. Out from it went the four different directions, each of which had four different colors associated with them, and in each of those directions there were different clans and tribes. This shouldn't be seen in isolation, because all the way around the world we have similar ideas of these world trees or cosmic trees.
The tree of life is a symbol that's found in many cultures and civilizations down through history all over the world. The ancient Norse civilization in Europe had the sacred tree Yggdrasil, and they believe it connected the world of the gods with the world of humans and then down to the underworld. The ancient Indian spiritual text, the Bhagavad Gita, speaks of a tree of life with its roots going up and its branches going down. The essential thing to understand is that the real self is the conscious self, and the physical body, be it a human body or a plant body or an animal body, is a vehicle for that conscious self, which originally existed as a divine spark on the higher level of reality. This is one of the main Gnostic teachings. So that means as long as there has been a material world, human beings and other conscious selves have been part of the tree of life here for millions or even billions of years.
If there is a universal tree of life depiction in almost all these different cultures, then how do we decipher the code in its branches?
Hamlet's Mill. It describes a continuity that seems almost impossible to believe between mythologies all over the world. In fact, they combine 35 different, geographically isolated, in most cases, mythological traditions and showed that there was an underlying commonality between them all. Now, one of the common things that you hear about in Hamlet's Mill is the idea of a mill for grinding grain, where there is a central axis and then you have this millstone with a rod going through it. There's a hole in the middle of the millstone and you grind it around in circles, and it grinds up the grain into flour. Now, the strange thing is that the mythology shows up in different ways around the world, and most of the common ways that Santillana and Von Deschen talk about is the world tree. So instead of it being an actual axle of a mill for grinding grain, now you have a central trunk of a tree, and the tree is actually something that fits into the same mythological concept that Santillana and Von Deschen are talking about. So what is the mythological concept? The myths always seem to describe some sort of spontaneous metamorphosis of the human being.
But how does a human form spontaneously? Is it possible that the tree represents an even deeper understanding of how we were created as humans?
According to my research, the tree of life depicts the frequency that DNA oscillates at. Everything is made out of a frequency or vibration. The wall behind me is all vibration. You could stick your hand through it if you were able to match that vibration. All genetics have a vibratory signature that can be picked up by technology, and the secret space programs are able to use this type of frequency to detect different types of life just by their genetic frequency.
If DNA has its own frequency, then how can it be manipulated and changed?
We are gods, we forget this connection, and the more you understand that, the more you actually become aware of your position in life. I think that's where the interaction is between the tree of knowledge and the tree of life. One leads to the other. Now, if you follow that through in terms of genetics, the more you come to understand who you are as a temple and as a god, you begin to alter the chemical structure of your own DNA. It actually starts to alter who you are. And this is something that we now know in modern physics. So in a way, you can see it as a tree of life because it means that you actually are altering your very own DNA. Your own thoughts and your own belief patterns do alter your DNA. It only takes a small change in the local electromagnetic environment to alter the information received by DNA.
Were the gods afraid that we could be able to manipulate our own DNA? And if so, could the tree symbology be a blueprint for this inevitable knowledge?
The world tree symbology also has a very interesting parallel in actual physics. Only recently have we really started to understand the value of the significance of the spherical torus. If you have a vector moving through a fluid medium, meaning if you just have a force moving through a fluid, as the force moves, it will naturally cause a torus to form. The torus is a curling of the fluid as a vector moves through it. We see in physical systems like the atom, that the atom is a series of toroidal shells of electrons that are all concentric with a nucleus. In much the same way, the world tree appears to have layers of onion-like shells.
If the tree of life is a representation of DNA on a deeper level, where can this be decoded in ancient texts?
The closest thing I believe on the planet right now that you might be able to come across is the original Hebrew language, which, when you begin to examine it, has 22 letters, matching all of these other ancient occult secrets. And those 22 letters each equate to a number value. And because of that, you can construct words that have a numerical value or a mathematical relationship with their surroundings. I think that's the last surviving kind of piece that shows us what that language was like. And no, it's not perfect by any means, but the fact that you can literally construct mathematical equations out of words and the words make sense, and that these mathematical equations interact harmonically with our surroundings is the great occult secret. That's the occult secret that every occult group has been searching for forever, and the reason why the Tree of Life, for example, where you have 22 paths and each equate to one of the Hebrew letters, is the basis of most of their occult teachings. What we know about DNA today, that they're still discovering new things every single day. But we know that the female and the male human body share 22 chromosomes. The 23rd are the sex chromosomes that make us different. The 22 is what's interesting because DNA is created in a spiral, and spirals naturally transmit fractal energy. What's even more interesting is that when you begin to examine a lot of the ancient cultures who were building these megalithic monuments, for instance, the pyramids at Egypt, there are 22 pyramids along the Causeway of Peace, not the 3 that they always show. There are 22. And when you begin to study the occult, especially the Western occult tradition that came up through the Knights Templar and into the Freemasons and into Crowley's group and the OTO, you begin to learn that the 22 trumps of the tarot also match the 22 paths on the Tree of Life, which also match the 22 pyramids, and they all have the same vibrational frequency. That's fascinating.
Interestingly enough, the Mayan Tree of Life carved into Stela 5 and its depictions throughout Mayan culture also has a strange correlation to the number 22.
When I was in the Yucatan working with the Mayan elders, there was an elder that came out and we were having the conversation, and he said, "It's easier if I show you." It begins with many branches of the tree above, and it represents the 13 heavens that we aspire to. Below, the root system represents what they call the 9 levels of the underworld. 9 hells is what the Western tradition would call them. And the area in between is Earth.
Could the Tree of Life really be a secret code for our physical existence on the planet? Could it explain our material existence in this density?
If you look at the idea that the planets are not just being held in some strange combination of centrifugal and centripetal force, but there is some sort of greater emanation from the sun that's holding them in place, because their orbits should not be so consistent over many thousands of years. And that is what mainstream scientists have said. They've had a big problem trying to figure out, why do planets not lose their energy and crash into the sun? I've often modeled this idea that the planets themselves are on spherical layers, that there's a spherical force field holding each planet in place, and that's what determines its orbit. Which means if you look at our solar system from the perspective of the afterlife, you would see a series of concentric spheres with a central axis, and it would look like a tree. And what I find really interesting is that PMH Atwater in one of her books describes her own near-death experience where when she got thrown out of her body into the solar system, she saw a phenomenon of what looked like a series of umbrellas of energy. And the central stalk of the umbrella was where the sun is. Well, that's the world tree. The ancient beings seem to have left behind mythologies like the World Tree on purpose because they got us closer to the understanding of how physics really work. The ubiquity of the spherical torus in any type of energetic system you're looking at, biological, cellular life, molecules, the energy fields of planets, the energy fields of the solar system, even the energy fields of galaxies appear to have these spherical toroidal shapes in them. So it's a trail of breadcrumbs leading us down a very interesting line of investigation. And when you start to understand this, you can no longer look at the inscriptions and see them as primitive. You say, there's something going on here that's very powerful.
If the ancient gods were afraid that humans would eat from the tree of life, and they were successful, could someone or something have picked up on this trail of breadcrumbs and have created their own version of our DNA? Reporter Linda Moulton Howe discovered some shocking links to specifically the Mayan tree of life and a DNA manipulation.
It was back in the early 1980s. I was in New York. It was another one of those phone calls, can I talk to you about? And this person, a man, said that he had worked for the Central Intelligence Agency, retired. And he traveled with another CIA colleague. And their destination was New Delhi in India. And they were given detailed instructions upon landing at the airport, maps, and he said it was really necessary that they went into this detail. He said, in that work, going to India, knowing that we are dealing with actual preserved material related to ET technology in a body, he said, we also were told that the last major manipulation of DNA in already evolving primates on this planet, exactly as I had seen in that presidential briefing paper at Curlin, was in Bhutan, in the Himalayas, 5,000 years, different ages. He said, I think the last was 2,500 years ago. And that was the creation of hybrids between Bhutanese and something else, and that we know, and he said, we have proof, that the hybrids in Bhutan were picked up by craft, UFOs, and flown to what we would today call the Yucatan Peninsula on the Gulf of Mexico. Then that was the Mayan civilization created in a hybridized program by even extraterrestrial biological entities, and they were put down in the Yucatan Peninsula to keep them away from every other hybridization program that they had on the Earth, which included putting hybrids in the tops of mountains, putting hybrids on islands, peninsulas, to keep their experiments on the Earth separate. The tree of life, at least this is my just basic understanding, that the tree of life in any culture's history has related to, we'll call it elites, who may have actually been handed information down from something, that we are a created species. But in religions, the creation of humans is allocated to a godhead.
I view DNA as an analog coding molecule. And when we sequence the DNA, we're converting that analog code into digital code. The ones and zeros in the computer, very similar to the dots and dashes that Schrodinger indicated might be the original code. And I've called this process digitizing biology.
If Craig Venter and his institute are correct, does this mean our code is part of a larger database or system? Is the tree of life the representation of the database we live in, or an invitation to free ourselves from the code?
Tree of life has also been sometimes interpreted to maybe mean certain drugs that give you insight. For example, we know that certain Drugs were used to gain psychedelic experiences, to try to gain insight into other realms. Ayahuasca is a very commonly talked about drug today, and that the tree of life may have actually been the source of one of these drugs that then gives this insight during life into these other realms.
Interestingly, in ancient Egypt, the tree of life, which is found in many scenes. For example, there's a fabulous scene on one of the walls of the Temple of Karnak at Luxor in Upper Egypt, which shows the god Thoth, the god of wisdom, the inventor of writing. He's the Egyptian counterpart of Enki, as a matter of fact. The god Thoth is beside the tree, and he's writing a name on a little object that's hanging from the tree. And off to the other side, you see the pharaoh Seti I, who reigned about 1400 BC. And what Thoth is doing is he's writing the name of Seti I on the tree of life. What he's saying is, you have been justified in the judgment. Now you have earned the life of millions of years. This becomes all the more interesting when we look botanically at the ancient Egyptian tree of life. It happens that a very good friend of mine, Dennis McKenna, who's the brother of the late great Terence McKenna. Dennis is an ethnopharmacologist. He knows his trees. He's very experienced and knowledgeable in this area, and he's worked on this subject, and he's identified the ancient Egyptian tree of life as Acacia nilotica, which, it so happens, is a tree the bark of which contains large quantities of the most powerful hallucinogen known to humanity, dimethyltryptamine, DMT, which, interestingly, is a natural brain hormone as well. We all produce DMT in the body. A lot of research has gone on into this. What's it doing there? It's present normally in subpsychedelic quantities. But why is it generated in the human body at all, and where is it generated? And there's more and more of a focus on the pineal gland, the third eye, as a place where DMT manifests. It's fascinating that out of the realm of plants, with the molecule DMT involved, the very molecule that is associated with the ancient Egyptian tree of life, we have these teachings of how we are to function in this university of duality, and how we can be nurturing and positive presences in that universe rather than negative ones. How, in fact, we can detach ourselves from the demiurge and approach the realm of spirit much more directly.
Could the tree of life hold a fruit of which we could see beyond our created world? Could these ancient representations give us the tools we need to break our third-dimensional prison? Some experts, like Jack Carey, believe the ancient humans tapped into a tool that defied the ancient gods.
Imagine a species that has developed a language that is so potent that it literally uses the laws of harmonic resonance in order to create instantaneous change in your surroundings.